Hello and welcome back to For All the Saints. I've got a great guest for you today, Jasmin Rappleye. You may recognize her from her excellent videos on Scripture Plus and Scripture Central. So we're going to be talking about the Kirkland Temple purchase, what that means, what was included, her thoughts on it, as well as a few other topics sprinkled in there, but primarily that deal because I just wanted her expert opinion on it. So stick around and watch that. Let me know what you think in the comments. Drop a like, share it with people, subscribe. And finally, I want to ask you if this podcast, For All the Saints podcast, has helped you in your faith journey, making and keeping covenants, taking a step to come back to church or to do something that increased your faith. Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Or if you don't want to drop it in the comments, email me at hello@forallthesaints.org. But for now, enjoy. Welcome back to For All the Saints, and I have Jasmin with me. Jasmin, a very familiar face. As I said to you before, my favorite Latter-day Saint content creator. And I'm not ashamed to say it, even though, some others may be watching.
By it.
It was fun. I've wanted to speak to you for a while on the podcast because I'm a big fan. And I was when we decided, I was like, normally you're thinking of, okay, how can I construct a fun interview that is informative, enlightening? And then I was like, we could talk about anything. There are so many topics that you've spoken about at length and helped me understand. But I thought that we should delve into, firstly, the stuff with the Kirkland Temple and all of that's been going on recently. And firstly, I would ask, so Community of Christ, do you know if we were expecting this at all, or did it come as a shock to people?
Yeah, so I should first caveat that I'm definitely not an expert on this topic. I rely on people who are much smarter than me to give me my information. But from what I've been told, what I can tell, yes, this was somewhat expected, but in my own context, I expressed just how shocked I was, because I was absolutely shocked that this happened so quickly. But we've known for a long time that the Community of Christ tithing donations had been decreasing, their numbers had been dwindling, and they had also been increasingly coming back to the church with the proposal to sell some of their historical documents, their property. And so it kind of, we had a sense that, okay, at some point, unless there's a drastic turnaround in the revenue streams of that church, they probably are going to want to sell at some point. And like I said, the last few months, I had been hearing some rumors, but I just, you never know what to believe, because it's just, they're like second coming rumors. It's just like, well, yeah, of course, maybe it'll happen one day. And so when I saw the news that it actually did happen, I was absolutely floored. I was shocked that it happened in my lifetime and so quickly. But from some church history professors, I knew they had been hearing, whispers that they were in talks for selling the Kirtland Temple. But so it was somewhat expected by some people, I imagine. And certainly there was kind of an overall sense that eventually the Community of Christ might sell the Kirtland Temple. But still surprising in a bunch of ways.
It was good. When I saw the post by the church, I was like, a joint statement. I was like, oh, this sounds important.
So official.
But Community of Christ, is it? So this is the reorganized church. Is this the one where Emma kind of thought that her son should be a family line of who should lead the church? Is that correct?
Yeah, so I definitely should have brushed up on my COC history before this podcast, I'm realizing. But basically, from what I understand, where we get all of these different branches in the church comes from the succession crisis of 1844. After Joseph Smith and Hiram were killed, all of a sudden there was the decision of, well, who is the successor? And obviously for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we believe that Brigham Young was the rightful successor. Rather, the keys of the kingdom were invested in the quorum of the 12 apostles. And Brigham Young was the president of the quorum, or he was the senior apostle at the time, and so he became the successor, and we believe that he is started the tradition of our church, which has now continued to this day through President Russell M. Nelson. Then you had Strangites, who believed that oh gosh, now I'm going to blank on his first name. I think it's Jonathan Strang. Oh, that's embarrassing. I can't remember his first name. But Strang believed that he was the successor because he believed he had a letter from Joseph Smith indicating such, and he started an offshoot. And you had Sidney Rigdon, who believed that he was the rightful successor to the presidency. But then you also had Emma Smith and her son, who believed that it was patrilineal or hereditary, that her son Joseph Smith III would be the rightful successor of that prophetic office. And so Joseph Smith III was the first president of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which later became known as the Community of Christ. And they have, for a long time at least, they've kind of kept that patrilineal pattern of succession with descendants of Joseph Smith himself. And yeah, that's the history that I'm aware of.
It's funny, actually, you mentioned it, and I feel like I should know this, but I didn't realize that Brigham Young was the most senior apostle at the time, which kind of it shows that's continued. I knew the story of. I sound like a terrible church member here, but I just always remembered the story of when he had spoken, and everyone in the room had that spiritual experience where it was confirmed to them. But yeah, I didn't know that. I feel like
I mean, the big clincher was when Brigham Young is speaking and trying to convince people, or just preach that the keys are with the quorum of the 12 apostles. Therefore, this is what succession should be. There was a metaphysical experience where a lot of people in the crowd thought that the visage of Brigham Young looked like Joseph Smith, and so that was a spiritual confirmation of that. In fact, I have this book. This book right here is Opening the Heavens edited by Jack Welch, and it has a whole chapter just documenting every single spiritual manifestation at that speech that Brigham Young gave, and it's kind of cool.
Wow.
Talk about in their own journals and in the minutes of the history, just people's different experiences, because they weren't all the same. Some people, it was more of just the voice. For some people, it was a very physical appearance. It was just the face. It was the whole body. I mean, lots of people had different ways that it manifested to them, but there was definitely some sort of metaphysical, spiritual experience that helped people understand oh no, this is God's will. So I think that story is really cool.
It is a very cool story. I didn't know about that book, Opening the Heavens. I'll have to get that on my Kindle.
It's about a bunch of stuff. There's chapters about, the first vision accounts and manifestations of the divine throughout, early church history. And one of them is the succession experience with Brigham Young. And the Interpreter Foundation is working on a movie right now, a feature film about the succession crisis called 6 Days in August. I haven't seen it yet or any previews, but they've already done a bunch of filming from what I understand it. I'm quite looking forward to it. It'll be a fun, dramatic presentation of that spiritual experience and the drama and the politics of, these different factions trying to vie for the succession of the prophetic office.
Going off topic, in Utah, do they show these kinds of films in the cinemas, in the theaters? Do you get to see these?
Yeah, so that's basically the audience for when we do films like this, because the Interpreter Foundation is an independent nonprofit organization. It's not the church. They're not going to show it in visitor centers, but in order to get an audience, they are licensing it out through local Utah cinemas. So this is their second movie that they've done. The first one they did was called Witnesses, and it went through the stories of the three witnesses of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harrison, David Whitmer. And I thought it was really fun. It was really cool. And they did it. They had screenings in local theaters in Utah. And that was pretty much the reach. And, I think it'd be great if one day we could have Latter-day Saint cinema in things like Amazon Prime and have more global distribution. But for now, it's often on a local scale.
Yeah, I'm just so jealous, even to think of the best 2 years being shown in in an English cinema or something. It's very, very cool to think that you could rock up and be like, oh, should we go and see Dune Part 2, or should we go and see Joseph Smith, Prophet of the Restoration? I would love that. But anyway, sorry to go off on that tangent. So in this deal, what else was included besides the actual obvious one of the Kirtland Temple?
So much. So, I mean,
Really?
I was talking to my friend Casey Griffiths, and he is a professor at BYU of church history. And he and Scott Woodward, they both run the Church History Matters podcast, and they went on the Scripture Central YouTube channel and were just kind of giving their initial first reactions. And they basically came to the conclusion and that this is like everything they have. I mean, not everything they have, but it is a ton. As far as the Joseph Smith era, it might be everything they have on the Joseph Smith era. I'm just trying to pull up the article here. But so Casey Griffiths at BYU, he does a lot of interfaith work with a lot of these other restoration branches, like the Community of Christ. And so he's gone into their archives and he is very familiar with the contents of what they have. But he was just blown away with how much we got. I think most people assumed that if we were to get the Kirtland Temple, it would be just that one purchase. But instead, it sounds like they've kind of bet the farm on all of their historical documents. It's in addition to the Kirtland Temple, there were quite a few properties that were part of this transaction in Kirtland and in Nauvoo, mostly. We've got the Nauvoo house, which is that's the one that, so the Kirkland Temple and Nauvoo house are the only ones that are mentioned in scriptures. That's kind of fun. The Nauvoo house was intended to be a boarding house to kind of just, welcome people from all over the world to come to Nauvoo. Mm-hmm. And so they started construction on it. The unfortunate thing is that it never was completed in the way that it was envisioned, because they had to focus a lot more work on building the temple. And so they had to kind of do a more compressed version of it. And then later on, after the saints left, Emma's husband kind of consolidated that construction. And so what we see today in Nauvoo is still a fairly large structure, but it's a lot more modest. And so the Community of Christ owned that for a long time, and now it's in the church's possession. Fun fact about that one is, for a time, Hiram and Joseph Smith's bodies were buried there, and then they were reinterred in the cemetery where they currently are in Nauvoo. But during kind of the mob persecutions, they wanted to keep those bodies safe. And so the bodies were transferred to multiple places. But the other cool thing about the Nauvoo house is that its cornerstone held a lot of documents. When they finally completed, at least to some degree, the Nauvoo house, they ceremoniously put together the cornerstone and a time capsule of stuff. And included in there was the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which was kind of a tragedy. I mean, it's hard to say, but the reality of putting the original manuscript in the cornerstone meant that it ended up getting a lot of water damage. The time capsule itself was not entirely sealed off, so it got water damage. Most of the manuscript of the Book of Mormon was destroyed. We have about 28% of the manuscript left, which did belong to the Community of Christ, but several years ago was sold to the... Yes. I might be confused. Yes, it was sold. It's in possession of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints now. You'll have to fact check me on that one, actually. But anyway, so it's kind of like a what if scenario, like, if it wasn't in the cornerstone, could we have the full original manuscript? But also the reality is that, these documents could have had all sorts of unfortunate fates to them, dealing with, mob persecution. They were constantly traveling, trying to keep these documents safe and secure. According to modern archival standards, would have been impossible in the 19th century frontier. So it's hard to say what would have, could have, should have happened. But that is one significant thing about the Nauvoo house, is that the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon was there. And what's cool about the original manuscript is we can learn a lot more about what the original words actually said, because we have the original manuscript, which is what fell from Joseph Smith's lips onto the paper when he first was translating the Book of Mormon. And then that was copied onto the printer's manuscript. And the printer's manuscript is what was taken to the printer, hence the name, to actually typeset the Book of Mormon. And so there are differences between the original and the printers. A lot of them are like accidental, just like scribal errors. Some of them are intentional changes of adjustments that Joseph felt that needed to be made, that, he didn't quite get the message across in the first version. So it is cool to compare the two. And it's a shame that we only have a quarter of it now to actually. But anyway, that's pretty tangential. I'm going to be here forever if I spend this much time on every single thing.
I didn't know that, though. That's interesting.
My favorite thing that we acquired was the Red Brick Store. That one is really, really cool. It's a building in Nauvoo. It was built to be, a general store, a place of commerce, but it had an upper story that was just an open space. So it was kind of a multi-purpose room for a lot of church functions, especially before the Nauvoo Temple was completed. And that is where they would have socials. It's also where they would have church meetings in a lot of cases. And the special thing about it is the organization of the Relief Society first happened there in 1842. And we just barely celebrated that anniversary this last Sunday, the 182nd, I think, anniversary of the founding of the Relief Society.
Which instigated a little bit of controversy on social media, right?
Yes.
Crazy.
It's been a lot of fun. And I have to say, I loved the devotional. I thought it was really, really good.
It was great. I watched it. Even though I'm not a woman, I like to watch all the things I can.
Good. I thought it was wonderful. And so I was a little bit surprised at how much controversy it drummed up, just because, I don't know, I feel like there's often, ironically enough, not as much attention on the Women Broadcast Association Conference and things like that. So the fact that people actually were paying attention, I don't know, maybe is a good sign. But yeah, I don't know. We could talk about that if you want, or we don't have to. But I'm like eyeballs deep in that right now, as far as thoughts about women in the priesthood, what people are struggling with, how I feel about priesthood power in the church, and it's I think in some ways with this particular controversy, and it was really about a single social media post. I think in that case, it's because we had like this sound bite out of context. People,
yes. So it was Sister Dennis, and she said, in no other religion or culture around the world are women bestowed with so much. I can't remember the full quote, but that was it, wasn't it?
There's no other religious organization in the world that I know of that has so broadly given power and authority to women. And that was just like a single pull quote from her larger talk. And at least from what I could like sense and tell, there wasn't a whole lot of controversy within, like, after she gave her talk itself. It was just like social media posts of that sentence was pretty polarizing for people. And I think personally, I think she clarifies a lot of that in her talk of what she is saying and what she's not saying. And broadly there, I think is the big key. She's not saying that our organization gives like the most or the highest or in comparison to men, but rather she's trying to make a comparison of women's authority in our church compared to women's authority in some other churches based on parameters that she explains in her talk. So I thought it was a good point. I agree that the authority that women have in the church is vast in scale. And I don't think she was remiss in that. And I think some people are missing some of that context when they kind of just see a pull quote out of context and are reactive against that. So there was a lot of, turmoil in the comments, I suppose. It was a very, very polarizing post. I mean, it was more comments than I had seen on any other post the church has ever made on Instagram.
Yeah. And but that was after they disappeared and reappeared.
I know.
Honestly, being sort of used to technology and stuff, it was clearly just a glitch. Otherwise, they would have had to have about 100 people all working on the comments section, like squigglies grab them.
And
so
okay. I think it was, I don't know, just a little humorous to see a lot of these conspiracy theories pop up about like the church is actively trying to suppress women's voices by deleting all these comments when it was actually just like an Instagram glitch. You could test that by seeing them across different like brands. Like a lot of other brands were having this I also like, I know how small the church's social media team is. It's a lot smaller than you would think it is. And there's no way they could actively delete that many comments, even if they wanted to. I mean, it's just, they're doing a great job, and they were doing everything they can to try to say, like, thanks, we're listening, we're trying. Sorry about the comments. We promise we're not deleting them. But at the end of the day, people are going to be upset about, things they're passionate about.
How do you feel? I know we'll get back to Kirtland.
Okay.
But let's spend a moment in this world. How do you feel as a woman in the church? I've not touched on the topic in my podcast because I don't want to be a man talking to another man about the female issues in the church. And I would want to devote a decent bit of time to discussing it. But I mean, is it more of a culture? I've heard stories of, for example, members of the ward council when they haven't been heard. But on the flip side, anecdotally, my mother's a faithful member and has always had so much positive experience in the church. And the female role models that I have in my life in the church have all had really good experiences. And I'm not discounting any others. But do you think that... Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, they're varied and they change, and I've never like really tried to systematically like really nail down my comprehensive thoughts on women in the priesthood. But I love the church, and I love the power it gives to women. For the most part, I do feel like the church is the most empowering institution on earth for women, specifically the temple. I feel so empowered by the temple, and I feel like what it's trying to accomplish is vast in scale. Like Sister Dennis was saying, it is trying to help us become queens and priestesses in God's kingdom, and it is endowing us with so much of power and authority. And I think so much of the abrasiveness and the tension comes from our different paradigms around power and authority. It's so popular today to talk about power in terms of like the social structuring of power. Who dominates over who is the victim in this scenario, who has hegemony and so is unfairly wielding authority over another person. But there's also just pure power, the power of God, the power to move mountains and to have control and command over the elements, over spirits, even over death in some cases, over healing. That is like pure, unadulterated power. And obviously, there are people who have God's power who wield it inappropriately, and those aren't situations we would applaud by any means. But when I think about having just that pure, unfettered access to God's power, his revelation, I think it is absolutely incredible. I think it is mind-blowing that God entrusts all of his covenant daughters and sons to use that power to bless other people. If we have the faith, if we have the covenants, that we can move mountains. And I have never done it. I've still got a long way to go before I have that kind of faith. But I think it's miraculous, and I don't deny that a lot of people have struggled and have had rough experiences in the church that are gender oriented, and I do know it's a sensitive issue, but I do think sometimes we can get fixated on the structuring of dominion, that we can lose sight of the forest for the trees, of just the magnificence of being able to hold God's power in our hands to bless his children, to create life, to administer ordinances, to heal people. It's incredible. So those are just a bunch of scattered shower thoughts that I'm still trying to put together.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And in those times when it does seem like if an individual is bad to another individual, or there's signs of injustice on a lower level or whatever, I always think of Paul speaking of how Christ endured the cross. looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endureth the cross, and is now sat at the right hand. Whenever there are times in those things where you get bogged down in the weeds, it's so helpful to be reminded, for example, of the temple, and to be reminded of the joy that's set before us, and look ahead and do that. But obviously, I'm not a woman, so I can't. I like hearing perspectives and hearing about it, and I appreciate you sharing that. But back to Kirtland.
So we were talking about the Red Brick Store.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Relief Society. The Red Brick Store is where the Relief Society was founded, and Joseph Smith, when he founded it, he said, I want to order this organization after the pattern of the priesthood. And he said things like, I now turn the key over to you guys, and knowledge will come down on this body from henceforth. And those are words we often use when we're talking about priesthood power. And so I think it's a really beautiful story and history and legacy that we have to hear Joseph Smith's founding of the Relief Society and his vision for it, that the church was never perfect until the Relief Society was founded. And we needed to organize the women. We needed to make sure that there was structure there so that they could then go forth in power to accomplish the measure of their creation and fulfill their purposes according to God's will. But even more importantly, in my mind, my favorite part of the Red Brick Store is that's where the first endowment took place. And I absolutely love the temple. That's my favorite topic. And it was kind of a makeshift poor man's temple experience. It was Joseph Smith had received this revelation of, trying to instill these temple ordinances, these sacred rituals, and the temple wasn't built yet. So they did it in the Red Brick Store. They went up to this top floor. They hung like curtains or veils, drapes to kind of section off portions of the room. And they even brought in like potted plants to kind of create like a Garden of Eden vibe. And they created these different rooms. They had like a creation room, a garden section, a world section, terrestrial section, and a celestial section.
Right. That's what I've tried to do here in my office with my new plant. That's going for the same vibe.
Of course. There you go. You're just making the garden room there. So they kind of had whatever materials they had, like little potted plants, curtains. In the celestial room, from what I understand, they had hung up like just nice paintings, portraits. Anyone had. They weren't necessarily like pictures of Jesus or kind of the sacred imagery we're used to in temples today, but just anything to make it a nice room, a nice section of a room. And I don't, off the top of my head, I can't remember how many individuals were actually there, but it was really just a handful. And it was Joseph. I mean, it was like a multiple hour ordeal, and he administered these ordinances, these washings and anointings, these covenants, this narrative. It's, this ritual drama of creation, fall, and then learning how to return to the presence of Heavenly Father, which we represent with the celestial room. And after it was done, Joseph Smith turns to Brigham and basically told him, this isn't ordered right. I want to entrust this to you to kind of systematize this ordinance. And so once Joseph Smith passed away, that's exactly what Brigham Young did. He really took it to heart to create a lot more structure around the endowment. That's where we get more standardized verbiage and the ordering of the covenants and the ordering of the sacred gestures and clothing and symbolic elements were kind of, more standardized under Brigham Young, and then even more so under Wilford Woodruff. But it all started at the Red Brick Store. It was a very rudimentary setting, but a very, very sacred one. So I think the Red Brick Store is fabulous. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the church does with it. If they're going to open up the top story and kind of tell those narratives about Relief Society and the endowment, how they're going to frame them. And in general, we've become a lot more open about talking about the endowment in recent discourse. For example, the Church History Saints did a great job having like pretty much a whole chapter dedicated to the institution of the endowment in the top story of the Red Brick Store. And so I loved the way that the church historians kind of told that story. And maybe that'll be part of the script and the curriculum for the tour guides that are there. So I'm really excited about that.
So is the top story currently not open to the public?
I don't actually know. I have never
Right.
read Brickstore myself. The last time I went to Nauvoo was quite a long time ago, and I never went to the Brickstore when I was there.
Right.
So
I hear they actually sell things in there.
it is
It's
a
still a
functional
store,
store,
so
yeah, like
you
candy,
know.
trinkets, and things like
I
that.
wonder if they'll still sell that here. We used to love going to the Preston Temple in the UK. They have a canteen under there, and it was such a cool experience to go, and you'd get American things like root beer and stuff. And so I was thinking, I wonder if they'll have a similar setup. But in the line of work that you're in, is there anything significant or particularly exciting about the documents that have come in that deal?
Yes, in addition to, so those are probably my favorite buildings that came in the deal. There are also some additional, just like random properties, things like that. But as far as the documents go, I would say the Joseph Smith translation and the characters document, and probably the John Whitmer history are probably the three most significant in my mind, or at least my personal favorite. So the Joseph Smith translation is Joseph Smith's revision of the Bible in the early 1830s. After the Book of Mormon is published and the church is organized, the Lord then commanded him to go and make revisions to the Bible, because the Book of Mormon talks about plain and precious things that were lost. And so he's kind of going through his own revelatory process to try to maybe receive some of that plain and precious stuff that was lost, learn from God through the Bible, kind of, an intensive mentorship with God and the Bible, so that Joseph Smith can learn how to institute the temple endowment, organize a church better. And so I see the Joseph Smith translation as like a very, very intense training ground for Joseph Smith's prophetic office in establishing the restoration. But what we have from the Joseph Smith translation, he starts in Genesis, and those first few chapters of Genesis actually end up becoming the Book of Moses that we have in the Pearl of Great Price. He had so many revisions to make, and there was a lot of extra material that just kind of came out of thin air almost, that couldn't necessarily fit in our little footnotes. So it was pulled out as the separate book of sacred scripture, the Book of Moses, where we get extra information about Moses going into the mountain and conversing with God. We get extra information. Well, we have an adapted creation account and an adapted fall account that's more in line with what we receive in the temple. And we learn about Enoch more than we would in the others. And so it's a really beautiful book of scripture, but then he continues throughout the Bible and makes smaller edits, some large expansions, even into the New Testament. And the entirety of that manuscript, or the multiple manuscripts, were owned by the Community of Christ. And the church has, portions of it that they've published in their standard scriptures publication, where in the footnotes you'll be like, oh, the JST says this word should be that instead. So we have little bits of that, and we have published versions of the Joseph Smith translation through like commercial presses, but for the most part, the Community of Christ has controlled copyright of the Joseph Smith translation and distribution of that. So we haven't been able to like put the entire Joseph Smith translation in the Gospel Library app, for example. We've never had permission to do that. So with this transaction, now scholars in our church who want to study the Joseph Smith translation just need to go to the Salt Lake Church History Library Archives instead of going to Iowa or to Ohio. And now, not Iowa, Missouri. And then also we could potentially publish this more. So we can have a comprehensive Joseph Smith translation that we can either put in the Gospel Library app as a supplemental resource, or maybe like insert right into our scriptures. I have no idea what their plans are, but the possibilities are really cool. And so I'm looking forward to that. Now, the characters document is really fascinating. I think this is a really cool document. So a lot of members of the church might be familiar with the idea of the Anthon transcript. This is when Martin Harris was still kind of wondering like if the Book of Mormon's true. Well, not if the Book of Mormon's true, but Joseph Smith has these plates, and he wants to figure out, he wants to get some validation that this isn't a hoax, that this is actually legit. And Joseph Smith is very interested in trying to get them translated. At this point, he's still learning about his prophetic role. And so he's like, well, I've got this ancient record and the angel told me it needs to get translated. So let's go to some professors and see if we can get it translated. So he transcribes some characters on a piece of paper, and Martin Harris takes that to several professors at various universities, such as Charles Anthon. And that's where we have this famous exchange where Martin Harris brings the paper and says, are these real authentic characters? And Anthon basically says yes. And then he says, where did you get them from? Martin Harris says the story of where he got them. And Anthon, rips up the certificate he had written to certify their authenticity and kind of, shoos Martin out the door. But Martin Harris comes away from that experience really validated. So that's not what the character's document is, though, because that slip of paper, at some points we used to think that maybe that was the Anthon transcript. The slip of paper we have has characters on it, and it has ancient looking characters that we believe are from the gold plates. And we currently have this slip of paper extant, but we don't think it was the Anthon transcript because it's written in the hand of John Whitmer or David Whitmer. I actually can't remember. I'm pretty sure it's John Whitmer. And so it couldn't have been written by Martin Harris, couldn't have been written by Joseph Smith, because the handwriting's not the same. So we think that this slip of paper that we have was written around 1831-ish in the hand of John, maybe, Whitmer. And, but we think it potentially is maybe a copy of something that was the Anthon transcript. And we do think it probably represents real characters on the plates. I have some characters on the plates on my wall right here.
Oh.
So this right here is a broadside. We're going to have bad reflection, but basically, this is what they used to try to sell the Book of Mormon back in the day. They create this broadside poster of like the Book of Mormon. And so they would, this was kind of the ad for the Book of Mormon when it was first published. And down here, you've got characters. And I know you can't see it very clearly. But they use the characters on either the characters document or the Anthon transcript to kind of advertise that this is like an ancient document or this is an ancient book. And so comparing what's on the broadside here with the characters document, we can, they're the same. And so we can sense that, okay, these are probably coming from the same source, whatever they are, presumably the plates, and they're preserving authentic characters from this ancient Book of Mormon. So super cool. I think it's fascinating. There have been attempts by some scholars to try to like translate, but the reality is, it's probably futile to come up with a translation of the characters document because we have this transcription happening by just 19th century people who have no idea what it is. So, there's probably a lot of errors being introduced into what is there versus what's written on paper. I mean, if someone gave you a slip of paper that had 3 English sentences on it, you could copy it pretty well because you instinctively know what an A looks like, what a B looks like. But if someone gave you a slip of Arabic and you didn't know Arabic, you're like, I've never seen, like, trying to replicate that quickly or accurately is going to be a lot harder because you don't know the essence of what those characters are trying to represent. So there's probably errors introduced from the plates to when it goes to the document. But also we know that the language of the plates is probably not recognizable by modern linguists or just any language that we know of from the ancient world, because we know it started in the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. In 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 2, Nephi says that that's what we're writing in. And so people have taken that to speculate, okay, maybe it was like in an Egyptian script, but influenced by Hebrew. And then centuries later, after this book has gone through generation and generation and generation and generation, probably the language got distorted. And by the time it gets to Mormon, he's describing it as Reformed Egyptian. So it's some sort of variant or deviant of Egyptian. So I wouldn't expect it to look like actual Egyptian that we know from the ancient world, because they would have adapted it and changed it, and it was influenced by their own environment, their own linguistic and scribal tradition. So what we have in the characters document is, just a tiny little glimpse into what that language could have been. But because we have nothing to really compare it to, it's going to be very difficult to actually try to make sense of what it actually is. There have been people that have tried and have come up with some interesting possibilities, but Yeah, I think we're just gonna have to wait for the Lord on that one. So those are the most important ones. There's also the John Whitmer history. This is the first history of the church. When I spoke briefly with, I attended a press conference with the church historian Elder McKay, and someone asked him what was his favorite. He said the John Whitmer history personally, because John Whitmer was the first church historian, and he is currently the church historian, so he feels that kindred connection to his first forebears. So that's really significant too. Very, very, very cool stuff.
That's fascinating. I met Elder McKay the other week.
Really?
I've always admired his public speaking ability. He's an excellent public speaker. But but anyway, that's really fascinating. And I didn't know that about did you call it a broadside, the Book of Mormon like poster as well with the...
Yeah, broadside. It's just, what people would hang up around town to let people know.
Oh yeah. Is that like accessible? Like, can anyone buy one of those, or is that a special thing that you have?
I was given this one. I'm pretty sure there are people online who will sell it.
I want one to go like right here.
Yeah, it's a great. Love it.
Yeah, I'm interested to get your thoughts on this, your sort of personal reflection on this as a UK Latter-day Saint. Why should I don't want to say why should I care, but why is the purchase of the Kirtland Temple and having it under our ownership significant? And these other stores, is this purely a historical sort of tourist thing, or is it indicative of something greater or deeper than that?
That is a good question. I don't know if I'm going to have a great answer for you, but just thinking here. One of the reasons I think that the church ownership over the Kirkland Temple is a positive thing net across the board for everyone involved is because the church has so many more resources to historically preserve it. And so they're going to be, studying this building, researching its history and where its current state, and then putting together schedules for renovation and preservation to make sure that it can get the top tier treatment that it needs. And I think that's a benefit for people in the community of Christ and people in our church, that we can just do this building physically justice. But as you mentioned, that really only benefits people who physically can visit it. And I don't know when I'm going to be able to go to, the Midwestern United States next, because I'm here in the Mountain West. And so will I ever be able to benefit from the Kirtland Temple? I don't know. But now that the church does have ownership over it, I do think they're hoping to make it virtually a lot more accessible than it's been. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they're going to try to be doing, virtual tours of the Kirtland Temple. And if their research in preservation leads to new information that we never had before. Now that we have our own church historians trying to take a stab at it, we may end up discovering new things about the Kirtland Temple, about church history that no one knew before, and now everyone in the church gets to benefit from. I know there are some people who would love to do 3D models of the Kirtland Temple. We have actually at Scripture Central, we have a team who's trying to work on creating a 3D model right now, specifically trying to reconstruct the veil system. So we know through the documentation that they would, pull down veils, try to section off portions of the large assembly hall, but also where the pulpits were. When Jesus Christ appeared to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery at the dedication, they went behind the veil. Now, it's always been unclear, were these just falling down from the ceiling? Were they being pulleyed up? Was it sectioned off? How was it mechanically actually working? And to our knowledge, no one has really been able to crack this. And so we've had 3D modelers trying to mechanically work through that engineering issue. And they think they've come up with the solution. I haven't seen the final product yet, but I've only seen preliminary renderings of their models. And it's really, really cool. So I think being able to now go in and study that in more depth can be a blessing to people more broadly. But I don't know. I don't know nearly enough about what's on the church's agenda for how it's going to impact the Latter-day Saints in America versus globally. I do think overall the church is interested in pouring less into specific cultural gems of the United States in order to make sure resources are going abroad more across the globe. We've been we used to do a lot more pageants in Hilkamora and in Nauvoo and in Manti, and the church has been increasingly shutting down a lot of these pageants because they were very expensive affairs. And like, it really is just reinforcing a very American-centric Latter-day Saint culture where the Lord's got a lot of hastening to do elsewhere. So we should be funneling those sacred resources to where they're most needed. So I don't know. That's a long way of saying who knows what the church has in store and what their sights are for the Kirtland Temple, specifically for United States saints, versus how they hope to benefit the global church too.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting reflection, and I'll just apologize for viewers. My blue light just went off, so my room is now looking very jaundiced. But yeah, for me, I do think it's an interesting way for us to be linked to our past in a real way, and at a time with Elder Ballard's passing seems quite significant in the sense of, I think now, again, I said this in another episode, but I might be completely wrong, so I apologize and someone should fact check me. But I think it's the first time in the history of the church where we haven't had someone in the Quorum of the 12 or First Presidency who is a direct descendant of Joseph or Hiram Smith. And so it's almost like as it moves on in that way, we have this really real reminder of our past as the church does become more international and linking to what is an incredibly inspiring and mind-boggling history that I feel very proud of, even though my great-grandfather joined the church on my father's side. And so I guess that's relatively new compared to a lot of people in America, but a history that I'm still incredibly proud of.
That's a really, really good point that you make. I think even though a lot of people in the global church are going to have different experiences of how they came to the church, we still are linked to our pioneer pasts in some ways. In my own personal history, on one side of my family, I've got very deep roots in pioneer ancestry that goes all the way back. And so I feel like a personal connection to that. But on the other half of my family, it goes back to converts in South America. And so they have zero connection to like the pioneer Latter-day Saint heritage necessarily. But nonetheless, I always grew up feeling like even that side of the family had a deep connection, those first converts, because all of a sudden they're linking their story with this other legacy, and it's their story now, and it's my story, even though it's only half of my physical family heritage.
Mm-hmm. I love participating. You spoke of the pageants, and I always get involved with the British pageant over here, and I got to play Heber C. Kimball last year, which was incredible to just soak yourself in the history. It really is magnificent. And well, in fact, based on what you said, do you know why the Kirtland Temple is the design that it looks like a chapel? It doesn't look like what I would expect a temple to look like. And I've always wondered what the initials mean on all of the different, like there's like 30 pulpits or something. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, only a little bit. So I probably can't actually help you on the initials of the pulpits. I knew that answer at some point, and it's just escaping me. But as far as the actual construction of the temple, this was given by revelation. Joseph Smith felt like the Lord had a specific design that he wanted for the Kirtland Temple, and it is very different than the temples we have today. Kirtland Temple, big giant assembly hall. It's like a chapel, lots of pews. There's pulpits on both ends, and they would conduct sacred, like, sacrament meetings and church meetings there. In temples today, there is no large gathering space in the same way. It is compartmentalized into small rooms because we perform a lot of different ordinances there. We, do baptisms for the dead, but then in the endowment ceremony, we will progress sometimes, depending on the temple, from like a creation narrative to talking about the fall of Adam and Eve in a different room. Sometimes we'll go to another room to talk about the terrestrial world, and then progress. In all temples, we progress to the final room, which is the celestial room, indicating the presence of God. And so because we have these different ordinances, it's chopped up in different ways. The building itself is physically compartmentalized. The reality is the reason it's constructed differently is because those ordinances were not in place during the Kirtland era. So the endowment was first instituted formally in its full form in 1842 during the Nauvoo period. And
Oh,
so
of course, yeah.
because of that, in Kirtland, they knew they needed to build a house of the Lord. The Lord was teaching them line upon line, precept upon precept. My house is a house of order. We need a place of worship to worship God. And so you can learn about the principles of why temples are important. And they did perform some ordinances there. But from what we can tell in the documentary history, they were probably like preliminary ordinances to kind of teach them about the endowment. They would do washings and anointings and the washing of feet with just the apostles. It was mostly, a priesthood quorum sort of thing that Joseph did with some of his leadership, and then they would do it in the upper story of the Kirtland Temple. So it's kind of ironic because, the most sacred part of what's happening isn't happening in the main part of the temple. They're like shoved up in the attic, and that's where they're performing a lot of these very, very sacred rituals of washings, anointings, washing of feet. And this preliminary stuff is kind of what gives Joseph Smith the background he needs for the Lord to give him the next step. And so in Nauvoo, they're building the temple. They actually build it in a very, very similar way to Kirtland Temple, where most of the temple itself is actually big assembly hall, where it's more like a chapel with pews and pulpits. And it's during that process that Joseph Smith receives the full endowment with, there's a progression. We need to make covenants. There are symbolic gestures, symbolic symbols to help us memorialize our covenants. And there's a ritual drama that takes us through creation, fall, atonement, returning back to Heavenly Father. Oh, wow, this requires very different space than what we've been building so far. And again, line upon line, the Lord is revealing the construction of the Nauvoo temple, and they made the main floor an assembly hall, but the upper story actually did accommodate for those ordinances a little bit better. Instead of just the red brick store where they had to hang curtains, they had an upper story where they performed these ordinances once it was completed after Joseph Smith's death. But they had more solid partitions and a more structured, systematized way that like, okay, now that we know what this ordinance is, here's how we're going to do it. Here's how we're going to lay it out. And again, they kind of made a celestial back corner of the Nauvoo temple upper story, and they decorated it with some paintings that the saints just had, anything to make it a nice space. And they had different partitions for the different sections of the endowment. So, you can kind of see the shift of priority. Kirtland Temple, it's about, let's learn how to make a sacred space for God. And we're going to start learning some of these ordinances. We go to Nauvoo and we're building a temple again, but let's make more accommodation for these sacred ordinances that the Lord is just barely beginning to reveal to us. And then when we move to Salt Lake City, the endowment has been given more broadly to men and women in the church. It's becoming more systematized. And so in order to build the Salt Lake Temple, they build it from the ground up with that intention in mind. So there's a clear progression as they are learning line upon line what the Lord wants them to do with these temples. And so before the Salt Lake Temple is completed, they create the endowment house, which is just a structure. It was like a 2 or 3 story structure in Salt Lake City that was specifically made to administer these sacred ordinances during the construction of the Salt Lake Temple. And it had different rooms, even some like changing locker room type areas, 19th century version of that. And it was a very, very small temple that was dedicated and built for that very purpose, called the Endowment House. Then once the Salt Lake Temple was completed and dedicated, they demolished and dismantled that because it was no longer needed for that purpose. Fun fact, the first endowment in Utah was held outside. They took, I believe his name was Addison Pratt, was about to go on a mission, and he was not yet endowed. So Brigham Young took him and several other apostles and church leaders up to the top of Ensign Peak, and they kind of dedicated that sacred space for that purpose temporarily, and they administered the endowment to him on the mountaintop, which is just so appropriate to prepare him to go on a mission. And then this was before the endowment house was constructed. Then once the endowment house was constructed, they were able to administer those ordinances there as a temporary, again, makeshift location before the full Salt Lake Temple was built in its glory. And even before the Salt Lake Temple was completed, the St. George Temple way down south and the Logan Temple way up north were completed first in 1877, and I don't remember Logan. And then the Salt Lake Temple was finally completed in 1893. So big construction project and big revelatory learning process for all of the saints.
Those first temples are stunning. I really love seeing photos of them, especially with all the refurbishments they've been doing. I was
I know,
looking at
I'm
the
so jealous.
photos.
Image. I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off. I keep
No, no.
seeing photos on social media of people going to the Manti Temple open house, and I'm so jealous.
Yeah,
I'm like, oh, I got to get down there. I've got to see the new temple. It looks gorgeous.
those photos inside the Manti Temple really are something. I love learning about temples from you. I used to watch Temple Light when you did that. Um, some really, really helpful. If anyone hasn't gone and looked at that, I don't know if you. I don't think you still do it, do you? But
I've just kind of let it. I haven't like stopped it formally, but just other stuff in my life popped up, and I've
yeah,
had to let different priorities take over. So it's on a hiatus for the moment, but I do intend to keep going and publishing more in the temple at some point.
it's timeless content though. It really is valuable, especially for people preparing to go. But for people like me who I've been through the endowment sessions more than I can count on my hands, and I'd love to know from you what would you advise me in terms of maintaining curiosity and a spirit of learning as I keep going through, if that makes sense. And I keep going, and I want to learn more when I go through, and sometimes I feel like I'm doing the work because I've obviously got someone that I've prepared to come, a name of someone who's deceased who I'm doing these things in proxy or whatever it's called for them. But yeah, sometimes I do feel like I'm doing it to serve, and I would love to still be able to learn new things every time. What would you advise for that?
That's a good question. I feel like I'm still learning new things every time, and it's usually just what I'm bringing to the temple that day. If I'm struggling with a particular issue or looking for revelation or guidance on a certain thing, I'll often just kind of like latch onto something I observe in the endowment ceremony that I've never noticed before that maybe applies to that situation I'm trying to deal with. But also, I just love reading and learning outside of the temple so that it prepares me more when I'm actually in there. The Interpreter Foundation that I've already mentioned, they have a series of conferences they do every couple years called Temple of Mount Zion. And I think that's probably one of the most significant things that organization's doing for helping to create understanding around the temple, because they'll bring together different scholars of church history, but also ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, and ancient Israel, to bring together their insights on how the ancient world can kind of apply to our temple worship or inform our temple worship, or show how the temple ordinances really are very ancient in origin. And so they'll publish those books whenever the conferences happen. They compile all the presentations and publish papers and books. And I just devour those. I think they're so interesting. For the most part, I mean, like everything, it can be hit and miss too. But I think they've gotten a lot of great scholars together to explore these themes. And so as I just like read more and more about the ancient world, I feel like light bulbs are constantly going off. Like, oh, wow, that sounds suspiciously familiar. Oh, wow, that all of a sudden made that connection happen for me that I'd never considered before. And so then the next time I go to the temple, I'm trying to like bring that with me in mind. It just becomes clear. And I'm like, that's beautiful. That is so cool that, how could Joseph Smith have known? Or it's so beautiful that the church and the Lord is trying to communicate this beautiful potential I have to return to him in such a elaborate, liturgical, rich way. I think the endowment has so much beauty to it. And even with the changes that have happened, I think there's some new interesting insights that arise. I haven't attended the temple as frequently in the last 9 months or 6 months than I would have wanted to when the most recent round of changes happened. So I feel like every time I go now, it's like a new experience, because I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot all of these. Wow, new changes happened, and I forgot that piece happened. I forgot about this language. And one thing I've loved is with the new changes that have happened from like last February, is I believe they started putting the closed captioning on the video itself, which I hadn't seen before. At least in Utah, I've been noticing they've been putting closed captioning
Yes,
on,
they have. They have, yeah.
and that's been such a game changer for me, because most of the time we listen to it orally, audibly, but to be able to just read the words, I feel like is a different experience, and I love it. I can ponder on them more because they're easier to comprehend.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. It's what you're saying reminds me of how Nephi teaches us when he's introducing the Isaiah chapters. When he says we should liken all these scriptures unto ourselves. I suppose it's the same principle, really, isn't it? In that whenever I'm reading the Book of Mormon or the Bible, I get new things every time I read because of what state of mind I'm in or what's going on in my life at the time. And I receive revelation for that through that. So I guess it's having that same mindset for the temple, as well as, I would really like to delve more into the ancient temple and the all of that to get a greater appreciation for it. But I've really enjoyed. Oh, sorry, go on.
I was surprised because a while ago I asked my followers, like, what's one thing you wish you knew before you went to the temple? And I was surprised because so many people said that they wish they knew more about the ancient connections. And that surprised me.
Yeah.
I personally love it, and I'm such a geek and a nerd about that stuff that, like, well, of course I love that, but I just assumed that most people would not be as interested in that. But when so many, it was like the third top thing people wish they knew was like ancient connections to the temple. I'd like, wow, yes, I'm so glad you guys like it too.
I do as well. That's what I want to learn more. So hopefully you'll make some more videos on your Instagram so that I can watch those. But I've loved hosting you today, and this is airing on Easter Monday, I believe. So do you have any final tips for us for General Conference?
Oh, I just love General Conference. No tips, just a lot of excitement and enthusiasm and probably more predictions than are healthy. But I love getting excited and hyped up for, like, what are we going to learn this time? What are they going to announce? What big things are going to drop? And it's just always such a delight.
I had my first American Super Bowl experience, and I'll say I'm much more excited for General Conference after watching that. It's all of those adverts were just too much for me. My final question is, do you have any plans to write a book?
Not currently. I mean,
because I'm just saying you need to. I would read it. I would buy it. I know so many people would. So if you would, then
well,
please do.
That's really kind. I mostly feel like, it's just like the time issue. I feel very, personally called to be trying to share my testimony online and on social media. And, that takes up so much time that I'm like, oh, when would I, do something else? Or write a paper or write a book. But I mean, sure, one day I think that'd be great. But right now I'm just trying to focus on creating content for the rapidly changing internet that's always throwing me off.
And you do a brilliant job. If people on here aren't familiar with where to go, where would you point them to keep up with your work?
You can find me on Scripture Plus on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter. It's technically a scripture study app is the purpose of the Scripture Plus account. I work for Scripture Central. We create an app that helps you study your scriptures, like the Gospel Library app. But in addition to the scriptures themselves, we've got like verse by verse commentaries and videos and images and a lot of stuff. It's an awesome resource. And so on social media, I share a lot of those insights and a lot of my own stuff too.
Mm-hmm. And I can attest to that. It is a really good resource. But thank you so much for your time today, Jasmin.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
It's been more fun for me. If you're still here, then good on you. Thank you for sticking around. And you would love this video that's coming up on the screen there, I think. I don't know. But thank you for joining along. Like, share, subscribe, all that. And like I said at the start, if For All the Saints has blessed you or strengthened your faith, please let me know in the comments or at hello@forallthesaints.org. Thank you.